right, ladies and gentlemen, let's continue our discussion of memory and identity of early modern Greece by jumping into part 2. And this discussion is what I call the Hellenization of Byzantium. Now, this is an interesting term because Hellenization and Byzantium, historically, are two incredibly opposite phenomenon. And in the early 19th century, Greek scholars would basically argue with you that you could have one or the other. By the end of the 19th century, and certainly the first 2 decades of the 20th, not only would the Byzantine Empire be reimagined as a thoroughly Greek, medieval Greek empire, but it would be a continuation of Greece's Hellenistic contribution to the world, where it had left off, about 1,500 years prior. And all of this was, even more interestingly enough, the result of an unintended and unexpected insult from a German archaeologist. So, origin stories tend to be quite weird in their telling, but the end product creates this national history of the Greek people that, with the exception of about 500 years of Turkish rule, is just one consecutive contribution of Hellenistic learning, military achievement, and cultural contribution after another. So if you remember from part 1, we were talking about the existence of 2 general macro historical narratives of the Greek nation, the classical and the Byzantine. And the classical narrative was largely designed for external consumption and had its adherents in the early Greek state among a very, very small group of political intellectuals. And that's not to say that it didn't have its purpose. It was, in many cases, an ace in the hole for an early Greek state fighting against the Ottoman Empire, but it was very limited in scope. And, largely had served, I think, its purpose once a Greek state was established in the Lower Peloponnese, and had to now combat a far more intractable institution, and that is the Orthodox Church, alongside a number of ordinary peasants that had little to no understanding or appreciation or connectivity to this. So, the Hellenistic model, I don't think, was ever really designed to be universal, and I think it served what it was intended to do with the establishment of a Greek state. And so that's why today much of Greece's classical heritage remains, sort of in stasis. It just kind of remains as is, as a bunch of ruins throughout the country that bring in actually more tourist money than actual Greeks. I remember when I was in Athens walking around the Acropolis, the only Greek that I heard was when the tour guides were speaking to other tour guides. But other than that, everybody there were from outside. And so, that leads us to examine the second, more popular, localized narratives that centered around the Byzantine Empire and the Orthodox Church. And even today, Greeks have this attachment to the city of Constantinople, even though today there are, at best, 5,000 Greeks living in the city of Istanbul of a population of at least 13 million. But it is much more of an accessible memory than this classical period. So, whereas historians and archaeologists and Western civ wonks will, look at the Greek city-state philosophers, Greeks will look at Byzantine emperors. They will look at Hagia Sophia as a house of worship, not the Parthenon. They will look to Christ or the Mother of God or John the Baptist or St. Nicholas or St. Nectarios or St. Luke, if you get the idea, right? These are people that are more accessible. They are in communication through prayer. They are part of a church calendar cycle. And interestingly enough, it's not like this needed to be brought out into the public. It was already there in the public, but it needed to be taken seriously in academic circles. And that's why, when I said before that the Byzantine narrative comes into its own largely because of an insult from a German archaeologist, it once again seems, much more realistic when we examine it. So who is this archaeologist? Who is this archaeologist historian, right? It's a man by the name of Jakob Philipp Fallmerayer. And he wrote this book in 1830, A History of the Morean Peninsula. So it's the area around the recently liberated Greek state, and he does some archaeological excavations. There's a lot of Byzantine ruins. There's a lot of traces of pieces of other civilizations: Turkish, Bulgarian, Albanian. And he ultimately makes an argument that does not sit well with many Greeks, intellectual or others. He argues that the Greeks of today, right, the people that call themselves Greeks in the early 19th century, are not really Greeks at all. They are Hellenized Slavs and Albanians. And that the original Greek people that history writes about and remembers died out biologically, genetically, whatever, demographically, by the Middle Ages. So the people that we take for Greeks today, Fallmerayer says, are only Greek because they are speaking some kind of Greek and they live in the region. And he doesn't offer any real, DNA evidence. I mean, this is early 19th century or whatever. But he's basically saying that these people are not Greek, but they are much more likely to be Slavic or Albanian or Gypsy, for that matter. And the support for an independent Greek state in the 19th century by a good chunk of Western Europe at the time was largely due to what he called classic intoxication. Right? In other words, it's the British, the French, the Italians just getting overly romantic after so many books that they read in school. They're getting overly romantic. They help these people create a Greek state, but it's largely a farce. Right? They're creating a Greek state that is not of Greek people. And one can imagine that this was not received well in Greek intellectual circles. This is what I like to call the first real shitpost in an internet comment section, right? Sometimes you look at these comment threads that go on and on and on, and you keep clicking, view previous comments until you get to the original post. And you realize the original post was written clearly to piss people off. And, it's just comment after comment of, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Well, guess what, folks? The intellectual response to Fallmerayer was exactly that. It was an intellectual effort to say to this guy, in so many words, fuck you, you're wrong. But how do we do that, right? How do we do this? This prompted, and this is why this is so important, Fallmerayer's, statement prompts a renewed effort in academia to search for links of classic civilization through post-classical studies. In other words, if classical Greece has a certain expiration date in which, the Romans come in, or the Romans transform into the Byzantines, or, there's Bulgarian invasions and Slavic invasions and Crusaders and Latins and this, that, the other thing, right? The goal here is to show how a previously identifiable Hellenic culture endures. So it might not be the predominant culture, but what does it do to survive? What does it do to last until the 19th century when a modern Greek state is created? Now, these studies unleash a series of additional works on state-sponsored Greek historical memory. And the first thing that it does is expand the idea of classical Greece into a more late antiquity. I wouldn't say late antiquity, but I would say late antiquity classical period that includes Macedonia. Okay? Early Greek memory is focused exclusively on the Peloponnese. And what this leaves out is one ginormous individual, and that's Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great historically is Macedonian. The language of Macedonia was Greek. And so the argument is made that if Alexander and the Macedonian kingdom, and then later the Macedonian Empire, is basically conquering much of the Near East through Greek learning and culture and architecture and language and alphabet, then it stands to reason, therefore, that Alexander the Great was also part of this Hellenic culture. And so it's right around here that a more limited, historically fixed concept of Hellenism is now kind of turned into a synonym for a larger, more universally adaptable form of Greek. And if Hellenic Greek culture is eventually merged into the Macedonian period of Alexander the Great, then suddenly it is easy to start making arguments of Greek culture seeping into Roman. And while we can't point to the language or the alphabet, we can point to Roman mythology, which practically takes the entire Greek polytheistic pantheon and just Latinify the gods and goddesses with their own names. And also point to the idea that Roman civilization was very much sensitive to adopting and embracing Greek Hellenic identities and cultures as well. And if the Byzantine Empire is what the Eastern Roman Empire became, and if the people of the Balkans call themselves Romans even up to this very day, then it stands to reason that there are some connections that can be made that show that Hellenic identity survives. It might blend with other cultures and other identities, but it is not eradicated. Okay? And, these are going to make their mark into the political narratives of Ioannis Kolettis. We will focus on Kolettis in another few weeks when we talk about the Megali Idea, the idea of Greek territorial expansion. But it begins, really, in the early anthropological narratives of Spiridon Zambelios, who kind of lays the foundation, lays down the early, proto-anthropological studies of Hellenistic culture, traditions, beliefs, and values for this other person, Konstantinos Paparrigopoulos. So it is really Paparrigopoulos, one of Greece's first real epic national historians, that decides to take on the Fallmerayer thesis and provide a lengthy response. Okay? Now let's take a look at sort of the demographic linguistic map of the region. And, once again, just, look at my cursor here. This is here the original Greek kingdom of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. But if there are communities in what is still the Ottoman Empire speaking Greek here in Thessaly, in Macedonia, in Thrace, and still on the coast of Asia Minor. Here's Smyrna. This is where Korais comes from. This is Constantinople. And the northern tips of Anatolia around the Black Sea, with a smattering of Greek villages and communities throughout Asia Minor living among Turks, and then, of course, Cyprus and Crete as well, then it stands to reason that Hellenism is not just here, but Hellenism exists across the region to include everywhere Greeks speak. And so Hellenism is not just focused here. And the identity may have been subjected to demographic invasions of the 7th and 8th centuries. But even if that were the case, Paparrigopoulos argues, Hellenistic culture and communities were already living here in Thrace, and of course centered in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So whatever happens here is inconsequential, because Hellenism survives in a major, major city. Now, what is all of this before we get to the specifics? It's really a combination of two things. One, it's doing actual history and making a number of historical arguments for, connecting previously disparate areas into another. But it's also doing this with an agenda. Okay? Paparrigopoulos, like others, are determined to prove Fallmerayer wrong. And so if one is going to look into history to make the case that Greek identity survives, one is going to write with a proclivity to make that argument happen regardless. So it's a term that we use in the modern period. Interestingly enough, this is more so in pop culture and sci-fi than academia. But it's a term called retconning, right? Retconning, which is short for retroactively connecting. Okay? And what is retconning? Retconning is adding new information to established facts in continuity. And if older facts tend to conflict with new information, the older facts are going to be rewritten in order for them to make that connection to new information, right? So it's not like if new information conflicts with the old, the new information doesn't work. No, no, no. If we want the new information to fit, so we're going to screw around with the old information. We're not going to distort it. We're not going to deny it, but we're going to reinterpret it so it fits in with the new stuff. Okay? Now, retconning is more officially used, as I had said, in the pop cultural, sci-fi, comic book world to, rewrite fictional works like movies, comic book story arcs. Like every time that, George Lucas decided to tweak his original Star Wars movies, he is retconning them with things that he kind of came up with in the prequel movies that made absolutely no sense with the original trilogy, but rather than admit that he made a mistake and never bothered to go back to watch his original movies, he's going to redo some parts of the originals just to kind of fit with the new stuff, right? So if you're a real sci-fi nerd, that whole Han Solo Greedo thing where the scene is constantly rewritten every time a new DVD version of the movie comes out, Han shot first, Greedo didn't shoot at all, this, that, the other. That's retconning. Okay, that is basically retconning. But it is something that print capitalists have been doing for decades, for centuries, right? I mean, in many cases, retconning is how print capitalism crafts historical and cultural narratives. So, when we apply this to the Greek case, right? There's a couple of things that we have to take into account here. At the end of the day, it's not important if Fallmerayer was right or not. And, studies afterwards have shown that he's wrong. But what matters is that we make the case, even if the Hellenistic Greeks have died out, we're going to make the case in history that at the absolute least their identity, their memory, has endured. And that's enough to simply say that the culture continues to exist. Now, in this case, what Paparrigopoulos does is he continues to extend the Hellenization of post-Hellenistic Greece into the more recent past. So while Alexander the Great and the Macedonians were already lumped in, and no one's going to argue that, Alexander the Great, great guy, and who was his teacher? Aristotle. So there you go. He is now confronted with this dilemma of, if we stop after Alexander, we still have, roughly speaking, about 2,000 years Right? We got roughly about 1,500 to 2,000 years of something is separating us from Alex up until now. So what is this intervening period? It's the Roman Empire. And, the Roman Empire did one really interesting thing to help Fallmerayer out. And that is when the Roman Empire split into a Western and an Eastern half, the Eastern Roman Empire is Byzantium. And it becomes more and more and more, Greek as the centuries go on. And because the headquarters of the Greek Orthodox Church is in Constantinople, the former capital of the Byzantine Empire, that already shows that Rome is just as much of a Hellenistic civilization as the ones beforehand. What's even more so is when we juxtapose the Byzantine narrative with that of the classical, we realize that it is far more resonant with the majority population, right? Being present as it is through religion, active institutional arrangements with the church, as well as a number of social customs and rituals, right? So whether the ordinary Greek peasant knows this, they are living and breathing Byzantium in that sense. And of course, what also helps is that the Byzantine narrative accounts for a larger area of territory outside of the Peloponnese, which, again, let's go back to the map, includes far more important cities like Constantinople, Smyrna, Thessalonica, and way out here, Trebizond. These, folks, these are cities, okay? Athens, once again, if you remember from part one, Athens is Athens because Western Europe wanted it to be Athens. Other than that, left to their own devices, Athens would have remained as peripheral as Sparta, which still exists, okay? So the Byzantine narrative is much more inclusive, right? We have to remember how small and peripheral Athens was. And the Byzantine narrative encompasses far more actively recognized symbols than anything coming from the classical period, right? The Parthenon is a ruin. Hagia Sophia is still an active house of worship. Now, mind you, at the time, it was still a functioning mosque, but it was still a conduit to God. And even as early as the 1840s, a number of Greek politicians and intellectuals began to envision an eventual reconquest of Constantinople, the expulsion of the Turk, and the rechristening of Hagia Sophia into its rightful function as a church, the most important church in Eastern Christendom, if not all of Christendom. What's even more so, those people that praise the deeds and the adventures of the Greek gods and goddesses, this was the work of, a small group. This is the gated community communication. Okay? Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, none of them are, they are nothing compared to the power, the majesty, and the awesomeness of, in Greek, the Theotokos, the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary, right? In Greek Orthodox, I don't want to say mythology, but in Greek Orthodox custom, right? What we understand as the Virgin Mary in Western Christendom is basically a goddess in all but name. She is overwhelmingly powerful, unbelievably influential, and has been noted to intervene multiple times on behalf of the Orthodox Christian community. So, none of these pagan goddesses or gods could even remotely come near the awesomeness of these Christian figures. Not only that, most Greeks did not know any of these historical figures. Leonidas, right? You might know him now through the movie 300. Most Greeks are like, I don't know, who was he? I know who Constantine Paleologus was, the last emperor of Byzantium. Did Leonidas have an epic death like Constantine did? Did Megalo Constantine, the marble emperor? So what is in front of Paparrigopoulos is really a laid out battle plan to combat Fallmerayer, and that is to simply show the endurance of pre-modern, pre-Christian Greek customs and cultures through the Byzantine Empire. And if he succeeds in doing this, he now all of a sudden takes Hellenic culture all the way up to the mid-15th century. Fallmerayer's writing in the 19th. So we've got only 400 years left, and that, we can say, is the Ottoman period of occupation. But by that point, Paparrigopoulos writes, Hellenism was preserved through the Orthodox Church. So it's one thing after another, after another, after another. And this is why the Byzantine Empire, which initially was discarded as medieval, bureaucratic, irrational, illogical, oriental, suddenly comes back in as a crucial link for connecting the Greeks of the ancient world into the present. So Paparrigopoulos, undertakes this monumental work of writing, the history of the Greek nation, Historia to Ellenikos Ethnos, a 7-volume work that he worked on for 17 years. He started in 1860, and he finally ended in 1877. And, you can really regard this as a 7-volume fuck you response to Fallmerayer. And what he laid out was literally a history of the Greek nation from the dawn of time until the moment I submitted the manuscript to the publisher, and everything up into that point. So despite Byzantium, historically speaking, being a multi-ethnic empire, and, despite some of Byzantium's best emperors being Armenian or even Syriac, and, despite, one can think of, in a parallel universe, if the Armenians had gotten their act together, a few decades beforehand, the Armenians could have made just as much of a claim to Byzantium and Constantinople as the Greeks did, but, Greeks came in first. And, despite all of that, Byzantium was a primarily Greek-speaking empire, and just that alone was, enough for Paparrigopoulos to make this argument that Byzantium is part of Greece's history. And so what he does when he gets to the Byzantine period, and I think he actually falls in love with Byzantium at the time. Like he's almost like he goes native in a sense. I've read passages of this. He begins to change his writing style to the point where it almost reads like he's talking to you. So he starts switching into first-person plural. He starts writing about the emperors of Byzantium, not just as a continuum of Greek history, but he subtly starts putting in this idea that this is our history. These are our emperors. These victories are our victories. These defeats are our defeats. And when he gets to the last stages of Byzantium, where all that's left is the city of Constantinople, which falls to the Turks, May 29th, 1453, he writes of the loss of Constantinople, not as some disjointed, sterile moment in time, but as a personal loss, an open wound, an inconsolable sorrow. And what he's doing, rather deftly, is he is merging academic history and popular history together into a new meta-narrative that is sponsored by the Greek state. And by this point, 1860s, the Greek state is already a thing to, speak of, and it becomes a national history. It becomes taken as official remembering, right? So remember the importance of the state. What the state does, and we talked about this the week beforehand, is it helps to promote an official political culture. It helps to push an official, correct way of remembering things. Right? And you got to remember, this is the 19th century, so not everybody's literate. Not everybody has the access to publish, and this is the age before the internet, before the TV, before the radio. So those in charge, those that monopolize this type of mass communication, control the discourse. That's the whole notion of historical memory that we talked about last time, right? This idea of creating narratives that are now adopted by the state and promoted as true, as factual. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is making up history, but it does show that what Paparrigopoulos does, alongside answering Fallmerayer that the Greek civilization died out in the Middle Ages, he's saying, no, they didn't die out in the Middle Ages. They endured up to the early modern period long enough for them to survive for 300, 400 years in time for the Greek War of Independence. And it is now the emerging nascent Greek kingdom in the Lower Peloponnese that has a duty of reconquering and liberating all of these other territories where Greeks speak today, because it's their historical destiny, it is their historical inheritance, in that it is their legacy for them to liberate. Right? So let's kind of take a step back here and just kind of get a sense of what we've been talking about for the last 2 lectures. Because whether this is the classical narrative, the Byzantine narrative, whatever, this is a way in which history is mapped. It's structured. It's charted. Okay? If we understand history to be a chronological account of everything that had happened in the past, right? We kind of get a sense that history is very linear, right? Beginnings all the way up to the present. Beginnings whenever we want to start, up to wherever it is that we happen to be. More often than not, people remember history not as everything that had happened, but they remember certain key elements. Right? So, for example, when we look at the United States, and you were to ask, somebody on the street, give me some parts of American history, right? People are going to, remember the colonial period, right? Then we get stuff happened, Revolutionary War, stuff, Civil War, stuff, World War I, stuff, World War II, stuff, Vietnam, stuff, 9/11, right? So it's these memory markers that people remember. They don't really remember how one's connected to the other, right? We don't know really how, let's say if memory A is the War of American Independence and memory B is the Civil War, we don't really know what the War of Independence did to create the conditions for the Civil War. Again, this is your average passive History Channel watching individual, right, who, will argue with you at the Thanksgiving dinner table if you knew your country's history, blah, blah, blah. So when we remember certain things, we don't remember them in connectivity to one another, but we usually remember them as separate, standalone things. World War I has its own story. World War II has its own story. Vietnam has its own, story, in that regard. And when history is remembered by that, we remember disjointed things in the past without knowing, as I had said before, their connectivity. When we start to bring in the notion of memory and narrative, okay, we can start to appreciate and sometimes almost commiserate on the same level how certain groups make those connections, because not everybody has a PhD in history. And so if there is an attempt at, let's say, highlighting certain things from a group's past that are positive, but also not being able to forget certain things that are negative. We have to talk even in the United States. We can't forget slavery. We can't forget the way in which we treated the indigenous tribes, right? We're not going to forget those. And we certainly don't want to glorify them. We're going to, demonize them. We're going to commemorate the victims. We're going to do certain things, and what we're going to do is we're going to create narratives. And I've, as simply as possible, I've color-coded this to show. We're going to create a narrative between the origin and memory A that's positive. We're going to create something between memory A and B, and this could be separated by centuries, that's also positive. But then memory B is connected through memory C through something negative, like an outside invasion, a famine, a time of trouble. We're going to deliberately create the connection between B and C by altering the narrative to make it negative. to make it bad. We're not going to glorify it, but we can't ignore it in that sense. And so once these narratives begin to start stitching these previously disparate memories together, we can see very quickly how national histories begin to ultimately tell a story. Because that is what national histories are all about, folks. They tell stories. The national history of the United States that you learned, or at least, feigned interest in social studies classes in high school, is telling a story. It's not telling the whole history of the United States, but it's highlighting certain things, and it's also talking about things that you can't really forget about. So national histories are going to now all of a sudden assume connecting narratives between one memory and the other. The negative aspects are going to be understood as abominations, as detachments from the national history. And so what Paparrigopoulos is doing for Greece is stitching together a 3,500-year set of events into one epic story. From, the origins, and we don't really care that much about origins right now. We're really interested in modern history, but we know that the origins are, early civilizations of Crete and the lower Peloponnese. But people remember more, easy to, bite-sized, compacted things like the classical period, the Macedonian period, the Roman period, which then gives way to the Byzantine period. And that lasts for over 1,000 years until the Turks come. And then finally the War of Independence, up to the present period. The original Hellenic model, the one that was promoted by these early, European-educated Greek statesmen and Western European aristocrats themselves, were very much interested in connecting the Greek state of the 19th century with the Hellenistic period. In so many words, folks, the establishment of a new Greek state in the 1830s picks up where the Hellenic people left off in 338 BC. Yes, we've got a long period of hiatus, but we are picking up where we left off in 338 BC. After Fallmerayer's bombshell book was written, the very same scholars, for the most part, were able to at least extend this classical period to include the Macedonians. So that lumps in Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon, Aristotle, and others. But they had a hard time reconciling themselves with the idea that after 146 BC, right, the Greek city-states are becoming absorbed into the Roman Republic. And then, of course, the Roman Empire. And that is clearly being taken over by an outside power. That is being ruled by an external force. What Paparrigopoulos does is say, no, the Roman period is not the end of the Hellenic civilization, but more so, we don't become Romanized. The Romans become Hellenized. And they become Hellenized so much that in the year 330 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine moves the capital of the empire eastward to the city of Byzantium, renames it New Rome, and of course we understand it now to be Constantinople. What this effectively does is add another 1,200 or so years to Greek history. So it includes the Roman period. It includes the Byzantine period, which towards the end of its existence becomes more and more and more Greek. And there is a definitive endpoint, May 29th, 1453. That is the year and the date when the city of Constantinople falls. But by that point, Paparrigopoulos says, because the Ottomans preserved identity through the Greek Orthodox Church as the only remaining Hellenistic institution out there, it was enough to last for about 300, 400 or so years until the War of Greek Independence in 1821. And here we pick up. We pick up where we left off, not in, where was this, 146 or 338 BC. No, we're picking up from where we left off in 1453. We are picking up literally the day after May 29th, 1453 happens. And that is why today, modern Greek historical memory will include all of these eras as part of its national history. And the narratives are pretty much universal and largely do not deviate from one another. The only time where historical scholarship still tends to debate are the period between 1453 and 1821, right? The Ottoman period. Some will say nothing good ever came out of it. Others will say if nothing good came out of it, we wouldn't be where we are today. So there were some positives about the Ottoman period as well. The debate is still here, but the rest of it, no Greek scholar today is going to say that Byzantium gave us nothing or that Constantinople isn't important. So, in that regard, we can thank Fallmerayer for really forcing Greek intellectuals to rethink the Byzantine period and Hellenize it for what it is today. And this, once again, affirms the, the flow chart that we looked at last week in how socio-political discourses can become, or can be extracted from more primordial historical memories and myths, right? Remember, myths of history are how people remember pieces of it, and they oftentimes are wrapped up and connected to symbols. These symbols and myths produce a number of narratives, multiple narratives by time, place, geography, social standing, economic privilege, lack thereof, what have you. But when they all eventually crystallize into varying political cultures, one of them is going to make it into the primary discourse of the state. Now, within a democracy, you kind of vote for a political culture along with a political party. In Greece's case, we could say that perhaps initially, that the political culture of Korais runs the show for at least a couple of years. But after Fallmerayer's political culture throws a wrench in the cogs, we need a new political culture, the one of Paparrigopoulos, that does not discount the Parthenon or Pericles or the Greek language, but brings in the Orthodox Church, Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine Empire, the Macedonian civilization, and even in some cases, endurance under the Ottoman to create a new narrative. And today, no one really talks about Fallmerayer. No one reads his books. And look, it doesn't matter whether the narratives are true or not. It's what is believed. Okay, so that brings us to an end of our discussion of Greek collective and historical memory. And I tried to be as meticulous, but also as straightforward as possible. And I hope that after doing the readings, you got a sense of really what the story is here. And I'd like to get your comments and your thoughts in the discussion sections, but also in your reading evaluations. Next week, we do the exact same thing. We roll the clock back and we look at Serbia from the early 19th century up to the present period. So, exact same methodology, exact same application of memory, and I hope by that point we are ready to move forward with the historical development of modern Balkan states and societies of the mid to late 19th century. We got a lot of stuff to cover here, folks, but I'm hoping that you find it interesting. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.